Okay, I am going to give some brief introductions of who this lovely panel is, and then I'm just going to jump right into it. First, in the middle here, we have Beverly Guy Sheftel, who is the Director of Women's Research and Resource Center, for which she is the founding director back in 1981. She is the chair of Comparative Women's Studies, the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College, and she is the past president, or one of the past presidents, of the National Women's Studies Association, and that's Beverly. And then on the far end, we have Janet Halley, who is the Eli Gordston Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School and an expert on feminist legal theory, sex, sexuality, and gender in the law. And then to my immediate left, we have Pramila Nadison, who is a professor of history at Barnard College, an expert on multiple meanings of feminism and labor movements. She's also a former president of the National Women's Studies Association. So join me again in welcoming this panel. So Dean Brown-Nagin gave a little bit of the history of the founding of gender in women's and sexuality studies programs. But for many of us in the room, myself included, I don't remember a university without one. Can you walk us through, let's start with you, Beverly, if we could. Could you walk through what motivated the movement to start women and gender and sexuality studies, and how do we think about that as an institution in the university?
I'm very happy to be here as well. I want to start by saying when I think about the field, and I'm going to use the old name, which is women's studies.
Perfect.
When I think about the field of women's studies, I think about it not in terms of institutionally when it started in 1969, which was at UC San Diego. I think about the ways in which the field was operating in various institutional spaces before the development of the field, which I would say came out of the women's liberation movement, in the ways that Black studies also came out of a civil rights movement. I want to just pause and just give a little bit of history from my vantage point. I have spent my entire professional career at historically Black colleges, starting at Alabama State University and then moving to Spelman, where I have been teaching for 55 years. I also taught in the PhD program in Women's Studies at Emory University. But I want to say this because we assume that women's studies as a field is everywhere. There are 105 HBCUs, only 16 of which have so-called women's studies programs, which is different than courses. And only one of them, Spelman, has a major in women's studies right now. So 14 of them have a minor. When I have tried to rewrite the history of women's studies, which has not made it into the big history, I start with women's studies courses that actually took place on historically Black college campuses, and I want to just give a little bit because it was amazing to me. Margaret Murray Washington, who happened to have been married to Booker T. Washington, taught one of the first transnational feminist studies courses at Tuskegee in the 40s. And then I want to mention, because this is really, really important, and she doesn't appear in the history. Alice Walker taught the first Black women writers course at Wellesley College in 1973. And very interestingly, Barbara Smith, the co-founder of Combahee, audited Alice Walker's Black Women Writers course, which she also was teaching at UMass Boston. And that was 2 years before she co-founded Combahee. So Alice Walker has to be put in this narrative, taught Black women writers at Wellesley and at UMass Boston. And Black women writers is a course that I would say has to be in the origin story of women's studies as a field. So I'm gonna just stop right there. And I've avoided the institutional question because I think what I'm trying to underscore is that you had women's studies in various places in terms of courses, whether programs actually had been instituted.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because as these programs are being challenged, a later question I'm going to ask you is, how do we think about the impact of this work on the broader university? But Primala, if I could turn to you as well in thinking about the origins of women and gender studies, what do you think about its core purpose and its development, and what still feels essential today, and what might we have lost along the way?
Yeah, I'll just actually, I want to pick up where Beverly left off too. And, I have always known women's and gender studies as a field, as a department as well. But at the same time, I'm not in a WGSS program. I'm in history. And I want to say that because I think it's really important to understand how women's and gender studies have impacted not only this particular field, but all our fields, right? It's in economics, as we have heard. It's in history, it's in sociology, it's in anthropology. And so women's and gender studies is a way of thinking. Right? It's a kind of analytic. It's a way of understanding the world. And so I think whether or not we're in a very difficult moment right now, and we all know that. The attacks on the programs around the country, the Texas A&M, of course, the New College of Florida, University of Iowa, we can go down the list of the ways in which people work has been attacked, the kind of self-censoring. But I think we are at a place where it is very difficult to put this genie back in the bottle, right? That everyone, I teach labor history, I write about labor history. You cannot talk about labor history without talking about women. Women do the care work. During COVID, we talked about essential work, about care work. The reason that was so incredibly important was because of women's and gender studies and the understanding of the ways in which women's labor is absolutely essential for the running of the world. So I think I kind of answered your question. I think we have to expand out beyond the programs and the courses and think about the ways in which women's and gender studies as an analytic has really reshaped the way we think.
Thank you. That's so important. Janet, I'm wondering if you could talk about the integration of the law and the legal issues as it relates to gender studies and the study of gender and the impacts.
So, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. I teach at a law school. I've never been in a women and gender studies program or a women's studies program, but I have assisted in the foundation of the Hamilton College Women's Studies program back in the 80s. That dates me a bit. And was in the conversation about the transformation of the Harvard Women's Studies program into the Women's and Gender Studies program. It was an interesting phase of the work. And also the Harvard Journal on Law and Gender into a journal on, making the Harvard Journal on Law and Gender out of the Harvard Journal on Women in the Law. I think that legal studies has been very, very much affected by the dominance of law and economics and the model of using law to facilitate market and state practices, and that marginalizes the study of the household, the family, and personal life, or creates this distinction between the public and the private, and the state and the society. We manage all these things as a matter of the curriculum, and yet it has been possible to move a lot of work into the law schools. So I've made a part of my career to make law professors, and so I have mentees all over the world who are doing important work in law and gender. So it is possible. You don't need a program to advance the work. There is I think, a very strong cultural difference between doing the work inside a department and doing it inside women and gender studies. I don't know exactly what it is because I haven't been on the other side of the line. But I sometimes fear the development of a world vision in the women's and gender studies programs as being too consolidated and not sufficiently in touch with conflicting programs and research agendas and ideologies, and because of the isolation that the programs can foster. So the line between the two seems to me a very important one for promoting the excitement and exploratory character of the work.
Can I just say one thing, just historically?
My permission. You just go. You just go.
I just want to say, I took my first women's studies course at Wellesley. Massachusetts really looms large. I took my first women's studies course in 1967, the year after I graduated from Spelman at Wellesley College. It was the 5th year of study. It was a women in drama course. And that is when, even though the course was not intersectional, that was the first point at which I realized that I want to be attached to this to this field. And I left Wellesley College and went to Atlanta University and to do a master's degree in English. And most of these early black feminist scholars had degrees in English. And so I did a master's thesis on Faulkner's treatment of women in his major novels and started doing feminist literary criticism. So I have been...
What year was that?
This was 1967.
Uh-huh.
Well, actually 1968, because after I left Wellesley, I came to Atlanta University. So I've been doing black feminist literary studies and then black feminist studies since the 60s, before the institutionalization of the program, and have always considered myself a women's studies scholar. And I was sharing this with Primla last night, that it's interesting that most of the so-called pioneers in black feminist studies came out of English, including someone like Bell Hooks, who got a PhD in English and who wrote a dissertation on Toni Morrison. So I just want to say how significant English department courses and those of us who were in that humanities space ended up doing radical black feminist studies and comparative women's studies.
I'm going to interrupt as well if I can. and I'm
They don't
you know,
need me.
I started off by talking about how we can do women's and gender studies even if we don't have women and gender studies. I also want to say I think the field is so important. It is incredibly important. It is interdisciplinary, which is different from being a historian, because women's and gender studies scholars draw on different methods, different approaches, different ways of analyzing the world. And so I absolutely don't want to undermine or disrespect the kind of importance of that approach as an academic field. And the other thing I will say is that, you know, we heard from some of the previous panelists about the difficulties in the discipline, especially economics, but not only economics. I can talk as well about history. The lack of support that women get, the difficulties in having their scholarship respected. Women's Studies and the National Women's Studies Association, I will say also, which Beverly and I both were president of at different times, really served as a site that could nurture younger scholars, graduate students, junior faculty, and I think especially in an academic climate that's incredibly hostile, those kinds of spaces are very important.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, because in part the programs like this create a place of belonging that we heard about in the first student experience panel. But it's also a site of scholarship. And when I think about the challenges that these programs are facing, I want to ask the panel to think about just some of the language that's being used. So, for example, people talk about gender ideology, this and the lived experience, and how do we think about gender analysis and practice and the social constructions of gender. All of these kinds of words and concepts are being both objectified, but also politicized and have taken on, in some ways, a life of their own. I'm wondering if we could have some reactions to that. I might start with you, Primla.
Yeah, sure. I think when you listen to some of the attacks on women's and gender studies right now, especially in the popular media, in the press, this term gender ideology is being thrown about a lot. And I just kind of want to reflect on that for a moment. What is gender ideology, and why the use of that term? What kind of political purchase does it have? There's no such thing as gender ideology in the field of women and gender studies. We study gendered lived experiences. We study the social construction of gender. We study all sorts of things about gender, not gender ideology. That is a misrepresentation of actually the kind of work that we do. And I think it's used as a way to suggest that people in this field actually come in with preconceived notions of what gender is, as opposed to actually doing the research and studying. So I think we need to be really careful about the terms that we use, and also be very clear about the work that we do, and that it's based in data and in research.
So I was very struck when the word gender ideology showed up, because I'd been working on gender ideology from the other side of the fence. I regard myself as a leftist, occasionally a feminist, and very concerned about the vitality of research and thinking and teaching of our students to be critical in their approach to everything. And I've been disturbed by not only right-wing attacks on different intellectual agendas for representing gender ideology, but left-wing ones. So here at this institution, Carol Hoven said that there were two sexes, a concession that's been made repeatedly through this conference, and no graduate student would TF for her, and she ended up resigning. And I think that represented a gender ideology that is just at a different scale than the kind of gender ideology attack at a different scale than what we're seeing coming out of the White House now, but nevertheless a gender ideology attack. So I think that the term gender ideology it should be owned by across the political spectrum. We shouldn't allow it to be parked only in the White House.
I'll just mention, what's happening in the state of Georgia, because I just got interviewed by. There's only now one in the public arena, one program left, gender and sexuality studies. Georgia State, which has the largest number, probably the largest number of students in the state of Georgia, over 40,000, and the largest number of African American students, particularly those who graduate, has just shut down its undergraduate gender and sexuality studies program. And this is happening all over the state of Georgia, and it's extremely disturbing, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, I would like to follow up with you if I could, Beverly, because you, as you described, you were there at the beginning. And in a lot of the gender studies programs or women's studies programs grew out of the women's liberation movement and the historical pieces of that. And now we're at another historical moment and a political moment. I'm wondering if you can reflect on these two political contexts at the beginning in the 70s and now, and what are some similarities, if at all, or differences, or how do you see this as a cycle?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we're in, as far as I'm concerned, an unprecedented moment in terms of attacks on higher education in general, coming from the White House, these dear colleague letters, these executive orders, which are evil. I'm just going to even just say, for me, they're evil. They're not even just conservative. And so Black studies, women's studies, gay and lesbian studies, queer studies, Middle Eastern studies are all facing potential extermination, which means in many ways the absence of academic freedom. We have not seen this kind of federal attack on academic institutions, including primarily highly privileged ones, Ivies. And so I'm very disturbed by what I see going on with respect to these attacks. And this was not the case when we began. The attacks were primarily from maybe conservative folk, but not state and federal and regents attacking academic freedom.
May I say something about that? I think that what I remember from doing the work at Hamilton College in the early 80s, a big issue that we faced, and one of the reasons to do a women's studies program, was the intransigence of the disciplines. Good people were coming up for tenure, the disciplines were in the way. I think of, for instance, the fact that, as far as I know, Judith Butler has never taught as a tenured member of a philosophy department, which you would think would be her home institution. She's always been, as far as I know, I could be wrong about this, in interdisciplinary programs. I think that there's a kind of now the institutionalization is on the other side. It's partly owned by the women's studies programs, the rhetoric studies programs, the interdisciplinary programs. And so now those institutions have the problems of programs. They have the programs of long institutional histories, long habits, and institutional stakes to defend. They're therefore a target to be attacked. I don't think, I agree with you completely, Beverly, that this is an unprecedented moment that has been one unending shock after the other, but it should have been predictable to us that setting up institutions, when we would devise them to avoid the effects of institutions, would give us some of the problems of institutions. And that's what it's an easy mark once you set up an institution. So now it seems to me that having Pramila on the panel is really important because she represents in this conversation the strength of having a strong base in the traditional disciplines. And so I think just looking at, I think one of the things I'm trying to get at here is the over-isolation of women's and gender studies programs analytically as well as socially is a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if women's and gender studies was isolated intellectually or analytically. Like that has, again, I've never been in a women's and gender studies program, although I think that field in many ways I've drawn a tremendous amount of inspiration and knowledge and respect the work that's happening there. I think that this moment is in part about the fact that these programs exist, for sure. But I don't think it's only that. I think there's an attempt to erase knowledge, quite honestly, erase knowledge about women, around, about gender, about anything that people with a certain political perspective don't agree with. And it's beginning with this. And they're also talking about radical left knowledge as well, right? It's moving further and further. So I think this is about erasure of knowledge. It is not just about women's and gender studies. It is not just about Black studies. And I think any one of us who believes in academic freedom needs to stand up and speak out about this. And this is not a moment to capitulate. It is not a moment to find fault in the existence of women's and gender studies program, because that's not the problem. The problem is that we are offering a critical perspective, we meaning anyone in academia who is researching and analyzing something that other people find uncomfortable, are offering an analysis and knowledge that offers a critique of the world, which is kind of our jobs, actually.
Thank you. So when you think about the programs, how have they infiltrated the rest of the university? What are the benefits of having these programs over the last 50 years that we would see even if these programs, we hope not, but disappeared? What would we see as remaining evidence of them? Benefits.
The first thing I would say is that the mainstreaming that occurred from the program into particularly humanities and social sciences, less STEM, but the mainstreaming that women's studies did to impact traditional disciplines is huge. I mean, there are many spaces that don't have women's studies programs, but if you look at their disciplinary courses, they have a ton of what we would call women's studies courses. So that, for example, when we crafted our major in women's studies in 1981, we were able to craft that major because there were disciplinary courses throughout that students were able to get electives. So I think we underestimate or minimize, as Pramila has said, the impact of the field on many different disciplines, particularly humanities and the social sciences. I think there's more work to be done in STEM fields, but the impact is huge. I mean, I think it's not possible very much to go to an undergraduate institution and not experience courses that have been impacted by women, gender, and sexuality studies.
Thank you. I want to encourage the audience, both in the room and online, to submit your questions through slido.com and enter RAD questions or use the QR code, and I'll start taking questions from the audience. One of the questions from the audience I think would be interesting is they wanted the panel to say more about gender studies as a lens or method. They're more familiar with the topic of study, but not a lens or method. Could any of you talk about, what is the method? Perhaps Premila or?
I think that the method is interdisciplinary, like a lot of fields, as I mentioned. American studies, African American studies are interdisciplinary fields. So that in itself means that scholars use multiple approaches to analyzing gender. English literature, sociological methods, archival, historical methods, oral interviews. So the multi-method approach to studying women's and gender studies offers us a much more complex and robust and comprehensive way to think about the world and how the world is constructed and why it is the way it is. I will say that first of all. Second of all, I think, in terms of women's and gender studies, the topic is obviously women and gender, right? And so thinking about that from a critical perspective, it's about defining who women are, what gender is, how it has shifted over time, how gender means something different in one part of the world versus another part of the world, how class or race or ethnicity shape the experiences of gender and women. And so I think it's about thinking through this in a very critical way using multiple approaches.
So one of the things I wanted to ask, and I'm glad that question came up, was imagine time one before Trump walked into the White House for the second term, and you're looking at women and gender studies programs, and you're looking at the study of gender and sexuality throughout the university. Would we want to go back to the state of play that we were in before Trump? Or can we have internal critique even while we're under attack? And I will say that there are some things about time one, before Trump walked into the White House for his second term, that I would like to see changed. I'm so glad that Pramila mentioned academic freedom. I got involved in academic freedom on a big scale because of the perception that teachers of gender and sexuality throughout the university, in my perception, much more than other social justice-oriented knowledge projects, let's say, like racial justice or anti-colonialism, that were pervaded by mandatory moral or normative terms. And I use the Carol Hoven example as a snapshot example. It was intolerable to certain normative cores to cognize two sexes. She had to be run out of town. She had to be canceled. What can we do now, even though we're under attack, to prevent that kind of intolerance and lack of interest in other people's ideas from recurring? Can there be left internal critique now at a time of danger? Does it have value now at a time of danger? So that's my answer. It's not so much that the methods are consolidated, they're gloriously not, but there were normative core beliefs that it was unspeakable to disagree with them. So like a hypo question would be, would a WGS department, if it didn't have Trump in the way, bossing it around and being awful, would a WGS department be able to hire one of the, I think there's very clearly a new wedge of conservative feminists coming into play. Could those be hired into? A conservative, I define feminist as a person who has a project of distinguishing MF in some way, observing M over F in some way, and carrying a brief for feminism for F in some way. And there are now conservative feminists who argue that conservative lifestyles, conservative social values, religious conservatism are wonderful for those three projects. And the long-term question would be, could a WGS program hire such a person? And if the answer continues to be no, I think that that's a sign that we haven't benefited from the pain and stress that led to the turn to academic freedom before Trump.
One thing I really have to say, faculty in WGS programs have always been different and diverse. And also
more diverse than the departments that they might have been credentialed by.
No. And they are not monolithic, and there have been a range of political points of view in women and gender studies programs. Some, for example, don't even think about race. Okay, so I think it is inaccurate to say that we have been ideologically X. And that's been my experience over 40 years. Extremely diverse political perspectives, racial attitudes, notions about global issues. So I just want to say, and they have hired, from my perspective, conservative faculty. Okay.
Thank you.
So I was going to say something similar. I mean, my experience with women gender studies, with the National Women's Studies Association, has been there have been a lot of political differences and a lot of internal critiques within the field. And if you survey the scholarship, you will see there was a huge debate back in the 90s about whether or not to shift the name of programs from women's studies to women's and gender studies, right? And the implications of some switched just to gender studies, right? What are the implications of that? Huge debates, internal debates about what that meant. There have been huge debates and differences around intersectionality, a lot of critiques of intersectionality, a lot of critiques of race, of transnationalism. So there is no sort of uniformity in thinking, I think, within women's and gender studies as a field. The other thing I would say is that I think, as we think about critiques of women's and gender studies and the example you brought up of the person who didn't have TAs who wanted to work with her, I think we have to think about how power operates. Right? And I think one level of thinking of how power operates is to think about cancel culture, right? And I have a critique of cancel culture myself, right? But this idea that somebody would identify someone who said something or did something that they disagree with, this spreads on social media, and people say, I don't want to have anything to do with that person. And I think that's problematic because often that person is not given airtime to discuss or debate. There isn't enough discussion about what they said and why they said it. But at the same time, that is a very different use of power than what we're seeing now. With the power of the federal government and every arm of the federal government coming down on women's and gender studies programs, on Black studies programs, on higher education, on presidents, on faculty, on students, across the board. This is an unprecedented use of the concentration of power. So I think when we think about whether or not women's and gender studies had kind of sway over making a small departmental decision around hiring or anything like that, that pales in comparison to the ways in which power is wielded in the wider world.
I want to, as we think about the attack on gender and women's studies, there's several questions here on this. How would you link it to or connect it to other attacks on area studies and humanities? Is it the same? Is it somehow different for women and gender studies and sexuality studies? Or how would you situate it within this broader attack on area studies and cultural studies?
I hate to do hierarchies, but I would say that right now the attack on gender and sexuality studies, trans studies, is much more robust than, for example, the attacks on even African American studies. And I think that gender ideology and the anti-trans and anti-queer sentiment coming out of the White House with those dear colleague letters and executive orders makes women in gender studies right now, queer studies and trans studies, in a much more problematic position than even other area studies.
I would completely agree with that. I do want to go back to the theories of power, the observations about the kinds of power at play. It was 15 years ago this month that Catherine Lehman in the Obama Department of Education Office for Civil Rights issued the Dear Colleague letter that threatened universities and colleges with defunding if they didn't comply with some pretty vague and difficult to understand demands about how to reform Title IX enforcement. It was the Dear Colleague letter of April 2011. And Catherine Lehman went around the country threatening schools with complete defunding. So the model of what we're seeing in the DCLs now was something that the Obama people did. Biden carried the brief in the White House for it, as far as I understand, so I see a scale difference, but not a kind difference in that deployment of power, because she never went nearly as far in actually pinning an institution with the kind of bullying that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. So I want to say, I think that the left has been just as willing to use that kind of lever for what was essentially a left ideological purpose.
Yeah, I agree with you on the weakness of that letter, because I think it was not clear at all to colleges and universities.
About 3 lines in it you could understand.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that.
Very much like the DCLs coming out of this White House.
Yes, absolutely. But I think
out of this Department of Education, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
But I think that was a different issue. That was about sexual assault and harassment on campus. That was not about academic knowledge. It was not. I mean, we have a president now who is refusing. I mean, a federal Department of Education that is not funding grants if the word race or gender appears in those grants. That is very different from dealing adequately with sexual assault on campus.
So I would disagree that the DCL of 2011 was about dealing adequately. It was about overreacting and being profoundly unfair to the accused. The pendulum had to swing, but it was asking for it to go swinging way too far. It is a different attack. It wasn't an attack on knowledge. It was an attack on administration and on the forms of justice that were installed in student discipline and faculty discipline. Point taken. But as to the the scale is different, but the kind of power, that's my point, the kind of power. The sense of indignation and offense and personal and willingness to hear dissident ideas, that had a robust home on the left before Trump walked into the office. It just didn't have the institutional power of the White House.
So I'm getting a lot of questions, including people that are at institutions where women and gender and sexuality studies have either been eliminated or are seriously under attack. And their questions, the tenor of the questions are, how do we fight back? How do we consolidate our efforts? How do we think about strategies? What do we do to preserve the importance of these programs and the work and the thinking and the scholarship and the sense of community?
I'll say one fortunate thing about being at an HBCU right now. We are off the radar and not targeted. So my discussions have been with not with my HBCU colleagues, because they don't care about what's going on over there with you people. So my discussions No, seriously, I'm talking about the White House doesn't care about black colleges, and we know all the reasons why. So I haven't had to strategize there. So most of my discussions have been with faculty who are literally experiencing cutbacks, erasures, demonizing. And so, like Primla.
Yeah, so we should all go teach at HBCUs. I don't really have an answer to what we do, except to say I think we need to defend our academic freedom on every front, not only in WGSS, not only in Africana studies, but I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial for what we do, for our livelihoods, for our students, for our institutions. I think it's crucial for our society, and I think how we do that, it's difficult. I think part of the problem here is what's happening at the federal level right now, and some of it is, I think, a longer history of the ways in which there has been eroding support for higher education more broadly. And this began back in the 1970s with the decline in federal funding for public colleges and universities, and slowly we have seen universities and colleges get less funding from the federal government through Pell Grants, through things like that. So I think we have to continue to push and critique the corporatization of higher education. That's a huge part of the problem. One way to do that for me is through faculty governance, through an AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, or through faculty unions. So I think faculty have to organize, I think students have to organize, I think we have to find spaces of support within the institution and within these departments, and develop a strategy to try to ensure that both students and faculty have freedom of expression.
I'll mention one organization. This would only operate at the individual faculty member level. I helped to start an organization called the Academic Freedom Alliance. It's a legal defense fund for faculty members who are being targeted for some kind of negative employment situation. The gamut is run from tenure and promotion. It's very hard to do hiring, of course, but course selection, course approval, all kinds of things have come up into the attention of this group. And it will defend individual faculty members who are being sanctioned for their exercise of academic freedom. It's a membership organization. It's a alliance of left and right, and we have defended dozens of people. So I would mention that organization, because if you are being targeted for your exercise of academic freedom, I think it's incredibly important to fight back. And the AFA has a pretty impressive record of helping individual faculty members. The model is very narrow. It's about defending individual faculty members. It's not about defending programs. But I did want to mention it because there are, without doubt, people out there who the AFA could possibly assist.
We're coming close on time, and so I'm going to ask this question because there's a couple of topics around the significance of women's colleges in this moment, and I wonder if you could talk about are women's colleges becoming more significant in this moment? Is that part of a solution, or is that part of a collaboration? How do we think of women's colleges in this moment? And then my final question, so you can think about it as well as we're coming close to time, is in this really challenging moment, what gives you hope for women and gender and sexuality studies? So those two questions, and maybe we'll start with you, Primla, and go down the line.
Yeah, so I teach at a women's college. I teach at Barnard College. I think women's colleges could be a site of resistance and a site of hope. I will just say I have not seen the administration at my college stand up in a way that I would have liked to see them stand up. They have not defended the rights of faculty and students the way I think they should have defended the rights of faculty and students. And so I think as we think about this problem that we're in, we have to think about the multiple layers in which that plays out. So I don't think we should assume that women's colleges by themselves are going to be an answer or a solution to the problems we're finding ourselves in right now. I think we have to hold our administrators accountable. It is their job to defend academic freedom. It is their job to defend the institution.
That's right.
It is their job to defend the students. And so I will also answer the second question in that regard, because I think what has given me hope are my faculty colleagues, and across the board, not just in WGSS, but across the board, have understood the stakes of this moment and the ways in which we have to collaborate. And I think collective organizing is the only way to do that. And the students have been at the forefront of everything we've been doing. And they are very clear-eyed on what the problem is. They are very clear-eyed on how we need to move forward. So I take tremendous hope and inspiration from the students.
Thank you.
So I would say one of the things that gives me hope is students. Women's studies, we call it ourselves comparative women's studies, is one of the biggest majors at Spelman College, which is very unusual because it's an interdisciplinary program. And they are the most radical of students on campus. They are the queerest students on campus, and they raise the most hell. So that gives me tremendous hope. I will also say, though, that women's colleges are also experiencing difficulty. Agnes Scott, for example, our sister school in Atlanta, was experiencing enrollment problems. What did they decide to do? To start master's programs that are co-ed, because the enrollment was just really problematic. Mills College, as we know, had to combine with another college. And if I take our sister school, Bennett College, which is in Greensboro, has 200 students. So I think enrollments are not at Spelman. We have almost over-enrollment. But I think women's colleges are being challenged by enrollment issues. And it is not, I think, going to be the case that they will necessarily thrive if they can't keep their numbers up.
So I'm unaware of any professional school that's a women's school. The professional schools are co-ed. And I'm at such a distance from what the women's colleges are doing vis-a-vis the undergraduate education that I really can't pretend to answer. It is very true. We've been seeing those enrollment problems at the smaller women's colleges for decades, and they do frequently go co-ed in order to deal with that. But didn't Mills College do that at some point, and then it still had problems? And it got taken over by North. Yeah, so it's a tough one.
It stopped being a women's college.
Yeah.
And then went back to being one, and then had to merge.
Right. That's a tough history. So it's not a silver bullet to go co-ed. I just take hope from the experience that I have in teaching. My students are just so hungry to be able to think otherwise. And so some of them are here, and I want to thank you. It is a perpetual life regenerating thing to be working on ideas with young people.
Okay. Well, thank you. I could have this conversation all day long. Join me in thanking this lovely panel.
Thank you.